With over 20 years of raiding content behind it, World of Warcraft has seen hundreds of bosses across dozens of raids. We now know that in Classic, things started off super simple. Maybe a boss would just put up some debuffs, or they'd hit the tank kind of hard in the odd fight here and there. Over time though, raiding has evolved massively. Nowadays, the race to World First is a huge event, with professional guilds putting in countless hours to perfecting every aspect of the raid. And with the leaps and bounds the game has made, raiding has changed a lot too. Even as early as Wrath of the Lich King, bosses started to become more challenging, with the hard mode difficulty in Ulduar, and later heroic in Trial of the Grand Crusader and beyond. And then later still in the Warlords of Draenor pre-patch, Blizzard introduced Mythic mode, which we've had ever since as the new standard for the hardest content in WoW. And as raiding grew, it started to become difficult. A lot more difficult. Gone were the days of just dispel the debuff and kill the boss in under a minute. Instead now we have multi-part abilities, personal responsibility, and a lot of overlapping mechanics. So today I want to talk about some of the toughest raid boss mechanics to deal with ever across all WoW expansions. These will be the most problematic abilities which often defined a fight and made it so difficult to progress. So with that said, let's make a start. We'll begin with the iconic Lich King 25 heroic fight. ICC was a step up in raid difficulty for sure, but without a doubt the Lich King 25 heroic was the hardest piece of content Blizzard had made up to that point in time. It had DPS checks, raid-wide coordination, and the ever-dreaded personal responsibility. That's going to be a reoccurring theme here. But there was one mechanic on this fight which you could never underestimate. In fact, if this mechanic ever went wrong, you would wipe instantly, no matter how many weeks you had this content on farm. And that, of course, was Defile. So Defile was a big shadow pool the Lich King would cast on any random player in the raid. And on heroic, each time it dealt damage, it would grow in size and it would grow in damage as well. And basically, if it was allowed to tick and deal damage even once, it could grow in size and then accidentally hit another player. And then if that happened, it could accidentally hit another player, and at that point it was like a snowball that had got rolling, and it's probably going to be a wipe. The difficulty with Defile was that it could go on any player, even the main tank, so everyone had to hold their rocket boots cooldown for Defile, and just kind of pray you don't get it 2 times in a row if your class has weak mobility, because if you do, there's a reasonably high chance it ticks for damage if you're just running out of it. Just one more reason to always take engineering, I guess. Second is at times during the fight, Defile came out really shortly after your raid was forced to stack up, meaning the margin for error was much lower. And finally, you just really didn't have a ton of time to react after you were targeted with Defile, and slow reactions would always be punished by a raid wipe. These days, of course, we got to rely on weak auras to send off alarm bells when we were targeted, but I imagine it was way more difficult back in the day. By today's standards, Defile isn't too bad, but it can just be so punishing that I thought it deserved a spot on this list. Before we go on, a quick shout out to today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev is a platform that aims to equip you with the skills to forge a career in back-end web development through interactive lessons and learning. Boot.dev offers the tools to get fully on board with Python, Go, JavaScript, and other programming languages. It does this through hands-on learning, where you're going to be writing a bunch of your own code so you can really get a grasp of the fundamentals and understand what it takes to build your own projects in real time. For me, I find that taking on new concepts is just so much easier when you are actively engaged and have a feeling as though you are progressing. So Boot has brought in tons of features to make learning a bit more interactive and goal-driven, such as experience, achievements, and even leaderboards to keep you motivated. But even if you just want to check out Boot.dev before committing to it, it really is risk-free. All the content is free to read and watch in guest mode, and there's even a 30 days no questions asked refund policy on top of that. You can go to Boot.dev and try out their courses for free, and then use my code Willie to get 25% off your entire first year if you choose the annual plan. Thank you as always to Boot.dev for supporting the channel. Let's get on back to WoW. Next, we're heading forwards one expansion into the Cataclysm for a revisit versus another end of raid boss, and this time it'll be versus Ragnaros 25 Heroic in the Firelands. This is an absolute marathon of a boss fight, featuring tons of overlapping mechanics, one-shots, and hey, personal responsibility again. Whilst Ragnaros gained a whole new phase on Heroic, where of course he grew some legs, it's not something specific to Heroic, or the final phase which I want to pick actually. It's a mechanic which you have to deal with in normal mode too, and even in normal it can be quite easy to wipe on this. And that mechanic is Molten Seeds. This was an ability that had several parts to it, and you had to deal with it in a really specific way. So you would stack your raid at one side of the boss in preparation for the Molten Seed cast. When the cast went off, which these days we have a weak aura telling us when it would, I've no idea what the tell for this cast happening is, I just moved when it told me to. Anyways, your entire raid would need to run around to the other side of the boss at basically the same time. A moment later, Molten Seeds would hit where your character used to be, where you were all stacked. This meant if you ran early, you put seeds ahead of the rest of your raid and hit people, and if you ran late, you would get mega one-shot. When your raid had reached the other side of the boss, you needed to use defensive cooldowns, as the Molten Seeds would explode and deal fall-off damage depending on how far away your raid was. However, you also still had to be in range of the Molten Seeds when they exploded because they would grow into adds, and then these had to be dealt with via ranged attacks before they were able to run towards the raid and reach any player. These adds were CC immune and gained a stacking debuff from being next to one another, so if they ever got in range of somebody, they just one-shot them. And you had to deal with this several times throughout the fight as well. This was just one of many abilities Ragnaros had that would either one-shot you or your entire raid depending on how wrong you did it. Even in Classic, this fight did not mess about when it came to difficulty. What made Molten Seeds hard to deal with was the several parts to the ability, each of which had to be executed perfectly every single time, or you could very easily lose people. And Rag 25 Heroic was simply not a fight where you could afford to make mistakes in the long run, because you needed as many people as possible for the final part of the encounter. Those were the two heroic fights I wanted to highlight. From here on out, it's all going to be about the mythic bosses, and I don't think that should be too much of a surprise really. Raiding difficulty has only gone up over the years, and even the absolute best guilds in the world take some time to defeat the hardest bosses. Next, we're visiting the Battle for Azeroth expansion for the Battle of Dazara Lore raid. Here I want to talk about what has to be one of the most unique fight mechanics we've ever seen in WoW, and that's when players faced high Tinker Mecha Talk in battle. This fight already had some really nasty mechanical overlaps where you could easily lose players, and it also had a bunch of personal responsibility, because at the end of the day, when one person out of a possible 20 can wipe the raid, it always makes a big difference. But the mechanic I want to highlight here are Mecha Talk Spark Bots. So he would call these in periodically throughout the fight, and they would deal moderate raid-wide damage, but if enough of them spawned in, it became unhealable, so they had to be shut down. Shutting them down though was achieved in such an interesting way. So Mecha, being the master engineer he is, would use a shrink ray on certain players, making them tiny, and so they would take damage if other players stood on them. And when you were shrunk, you could hop into the Spark Bots as a vehicle. Each Spark Bot would have some coloured icons over their head, which would represent their shutdown sequence, and you could only see other Spark Bots icons over their head and not your own. So each player inside of a Spark Bot would have to call out the other's shutdown sequence so that it could be entered on their own spell bar. On Mythic mode, you had to do 3 of these bots at the same time, and if you were too slow or put in the wrong sequence, you took a massive amount of damage and were ejected. And if you failed a bot early on, it was kind of a wipe because you were going to get overwhelmed by them. On top of that, random players were shrunk, so you couldn't just send in the same people all the time to deal with them. This just felt like such a standout raid mechanic which I always remember, and it could be pretty tricky to get the hang of at the same time. So that's why I think it deserves a spot here. Following that, we're going to be staying in the Battle for Azeroth expansion with a trip to the final boss of Ashara's Eternal Palace, Queen Ashara herself. Ashara had been a character in the WoW universe from well before the times when it existed as an MMO, so to finally have a proper fight versus her as a boss was always going to be a difficult encounter. The mechanic I want to highlight here is the intermission phase Queen's Decree. This would assign commands to players which they had to do, or they would take large amounts of ticking damage and die pretty fast. These included soaking an arcane orb, not soaking an arcane orb, standing next to other players, standing still, or standing alone. On normal you only had to do one of these at once, so it's pretty easy, but on heroic and mythic you had to do two of them at the same time, which massively complicated the fight because everyone would get two different callouts. The phase would start and you had a few seconds to figure out what every player in your raid should be doing, who needed to stack, run, stand alone, soak, not soak, and so on. Due to the time constraints of the mechanic happening and it being random who gets what, people just had to know what to do without being told, which always makes things so much more difficult. Obviously, a weak aura was developed to assign players to do certain actions, so you didn't really have to think about it that much and you could just follow what the weak aura said. A classic case of Blizzard making mechanics which inevitably will be dealt with through add-ons, not so much by the players in-game. Still, I don't think the existence of weak auras takes away from how difficult this mechanic was. In fact, it kind of proves the point that if players, even the best players, need to use add-ons to beat the mechanic, it's kind of hard. Overall, Mythic Ashara was a very long and super complicated fight, and learning this mini phase was just part of the bigger picture. Now I want to head over to Shadowlands in Castle Nathria for the Stone Legion General's encounter. This fight was renowned for its difficulty due to a spell queuing mechanic, where depending on how fast the boss was progressed, bosses would begin to cast their abilities in a different order, which massively complicated the fight. This fight was just difficult from start to finish. One of the main abilities that would get progressively harder to deal with as time went on was Reverberating Eruption. This would mark several players who would explode a few seconds later, leaving a zone behind where they stood called Unstable Ground that dealt minor ticking damage. On each cast of Reverberating Eruption thereafter, more players would be marked who would also have to take these marks out of the raid and drop them at the side of the arena. But on top of that, the previous zones would explode unless somebody was actively standing in them, and if you didn't have someone soaking one of them, it was a wipe. And you couldn't always have the same people soak either because you got a debuff from standing in the eruption. This meant you had some idea of which classes could soak early on, but after that it was just ensuring that when each set of new Reverberating Eruptions were cast, that all of them were soaked, or you instantly wipe and have to go again. These types of mechanics where your raid just has to non-verbally deal with them are always super difficult and rely on your raiders being very experienced and understanding the fight perfectly. These eruptions of course happened close to other mechanical overlaps as well, putting even more pressure on the fight. Ultimately though, this was just another hard mechanic to deal with, even for the best raiders. Next I have an entry from, well, either Legion or BFA, depending on how you look at it. Blizzard have used this mechanic twice, as far as I know, and every time they do use this mechanic, it makes a boss way more challenging to complete, and this is essentially a matching pairs mechanic. So we're going to take the example from the Nighthold here with Star Augur Atreus. Throughout each phase he would cast something called Grand Conjunction. This will put a mark over several players' heads, and they had to run to another player with the same mark within 10 seconds. Also, they couldn't run over a player with a different mark. If you were too slow or ran into a different mark, the marks would explode and you would wipe instantly. Every time the boss cast this ability in a phase, more players would be marked too, starting with just 8 players, so 4 pairs total, that's pretty easy to deal with, and then 12, which is over half your raid, and finally 16, meaning pretty much your whole raid has to go find a corresponding player. That would mean 16 players have 10 seconds to pair up with somebody else with the same mark as them, and if a single person gets it wrong, you wipe. I think you can imagine how this boss would have been an absolute nightmare to progress, even if you had just perhaps 1 or 2 weaker links on your mythic raid team. He also had an extreme DPS check early on. The world first of this in fact used 2 healers. It was overall a big wall of a fight within the raid, but the Grand Conjunction mechanic was very unforgiving and definitely made things way harder. Following that, we're going back an expansion to Warlords of Draenor. You simply can't have a video about difficult boss mechanics without including Mythic Archimonde in the mix somewhere. This was the final boss of the expansion and our second face-off versus Archimonde. However, this time around things were going to be a bit more difficult than they were in TBC. By far one of the most challenging mechanics on the fight was a Mythic only ability, Wrought and Focus Chaos. This would mark pairs of players. These marks would affect every player within the raid and would fire a beam between them after 6 seconds, and then the marks would repick 2 new sets of player and fire a second beam within 6 seconds, and then it would repeat this a third time in a row. So 10 beams are being shot across the raid 3 times in a row from potentially different points with a 6-second delay between each one. And if you get hit by 2 beams because somebody aims them wrong, you're going to start losing people, and you just couldn't afford to have that happen. Due to the time constraints of this mechanic happening in such a short space of time, you couldn't communicate what to do either, and as it affected random players, it was pretty difficult to pre-assign positions as well. This made Wrought and Focus Chaos arguably one of the most unfair mechanics we've ever seen in WoW up to this point in time. Top guilds, however, developed a special weak aura which will put an icon on screen that would show where each beam was going to be fired between each player, so you just had to look at this and know that you were safe. But similar to Ashara and her weak aura mechanic, this would have been extremely difficult to pull off without any add-on help. And this was before you even got to the Mythic only phase of Archimonde either. Overall, a very challenging fight, which Warlords of Draenor wasn't short on, and it should only be right then that it has one of WoW's hardest mechanics ever. Now let's jump forwards again and visit the Shadowlands for the Sepulchre of the First One's raid and the Halondrous Mythic encounter. This fight had a new mechanic on Mythic, which took it from being relatively simple to absolute nightmare fuel, and this was because of volatile charges. These are bombs that would spawn in sets of 3 at the start of the phase, and then 3 more later in phase 2. Picking them up would deal a high amount of damage to the player and apply a minor dot. After you pick them up though, a timer starts where you have to drop the bomb again before the timer ends, or the bomb explodes. But when you put it back down again, you get a debuff which makes you take a massive amount of damage if you try and pick it back up again, and then another timer starts, so a second player has to go and pick it back up, which restarts the first timer. So you have multiple groups of 2 players juggling these volatile charges for basically the entire fight. And if anyone messes up ever, you wipe. If one player of a group dies, you're probably going to wipe because another player would have to fill in and flex. And on top of that, the boss itself was a serious DPS check, and is also spamming its own mechanics which force players to change their positions frequently. You had to make sure you were dropping the bomb in a good place for your partner so they were able to pick it up easily, without needing to walk into something which would cause them to take damage and probably end up killing them. This made Halondrous Mythic into a fight where you could really never relax. At any moment a bomb could go off and you'd felt as though you were never safe in securing the kill until the boss finally reached 0% health. Very tough fight to progress, and a Mythic only mechanic which made it significantly harder. Next we're going to Dragonflight for the most recent boss on this list. And number 2 is Mythic Tindral Sageswift in Emir Drasil the Dream's Hope. This fight can only be described as being absolutely relentless. In fact, it took more pulls on average than the final boss due to how difficult it was. One of the key things to know about this fight is just how many deadly mechanics it had, and as soon as you were done dealing with one of them, he was already casting the next. The margin for error on Tindral was just non-existent. It was all about knowing and executing mechanics perfectly, whilst having a ton of personal responsibility at the same time. And one of the hardest mechanical crossovers here was for the Seeds of Flame. Throughout the fight, Tindral would summon a ton of fiery seeds on the platform. Players had 5 seconds to soak all of the seeds, and if any of them were missed, an ad would spawn that would wipe the raid a few seconds later. However, unlike normal or heroic mode where you could crush multiple seeds yourself by walking over them, on Mythic each player could only do 1, so you had literally a few seconds to ensure that every single seed was dealt with by a different member of your raid before going back to the boss and then more or less instantly getting another mechanic. There was an insane number of ways to wipe on this fight, fight due to the pace of the mechanics and how little time you had to think in between them, but above all, Seed of Flame was one of the most punishing due to the time constraints and raid-wide coordination it needed. Which means at the number 1 spot we're heading back to Legion again for Kill Jaden Mythic. This is the end fight of the Tomb of Sargeras raid and has a reputation for being one of, if not the hardest WoW bosses ever, and he deserves that reputation. In fact, this boss was not beaten pre-nerf, as the damage on certain mechanic overlaps was just not possible to deal with at the time. What I want to talk about though is his mechanic, or specifically the intermission called Deceiver's Veil. This would have happened a good amount into the fight, about 10 minutes or so, and would cover the whole platform in shadow. During this time you had basically a few seconds to perfectly execute what needed to be done. First you had to locate Illidan within the shadow. He would be somewhere on the platform, you just have to assign players to go to different places and call it out. When you run up to him, he would grant players sight, enabling you to damage the adds. The adds had to be constantly interrupted and ideally grouped up, otherwise they would spam cast and teleport across the room, making them super annoying to kill. Whilst this was happening, orbs are falling at random edges of the arena that will knock you off the side unless you use some kind of movement ability to counter them. Of course, you're in complete darkness, so you can't see where the orbs are going to fall. Somebody just has to go and scout it and then communicate where they'll be, and you just need to know when you should use an ability to counter it. So all in all, you had very little time to find Illidan, interrupt and defeat the adds, and not get knocked off the platform, all whilst being in complete darkness and relying on your raid for their communications. Oh, and just for good measure, while you're in this phase, your raid is taking an absolutely massive amount of damage too. When you get out of this phase, Kil'jaeden says, "Somehow you survived." And yeah, I kind of agree with him. This whole intermission is just unfair, but those for me are 10 of the hardest raid mechanics we've ever seen in World of Warcraft. A quick shout out once again to boot.dev for sponsoring this video. You can check them out for free via the link below and get started on backend web development today. There were definitely some others that could have made the list here. Have you ever progressed any of these bosses before? Are there any other mechanics you found particularly difficult to deal with? Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.